Hi, everyone, and welcome to this new mini season of the Explicitly Pro-Life podcast. I'm Kristen Hawkins, and guess what we're talking about? Socialism. And the theme of this mini season is Socialism Sucks, so does abortion. And kicking us off today, we have a very special guest I'm so excited to finally have on Explicitly Pro-Life. It's Michael Knowles. Michael Knowles, as you all know, he has the host of the Michael Knowles Show, the Daily Wire, the book club at PragerU, The Verdict, which I love with Ted Cruz. He's also a national best-selling author of Reasons to Vote for Democrats, the author of the new book, which is going to be called Speechless, which is coming out just this month. And it's going to be amazing, and I'm so excited to have him talk about what's happening, the political correctness we're seeing, and why socialism sucks. So thanks, Michael, for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's so good to be with you.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. My husband's a big fan. When he found out that you were going to be on the podcast, he actually got really excited. I think he might actually listen to my podcast for the first time. So
terrific. Oh, I'm honored.
So you helped me get a new subscriber. So I wanted to have you on. I want you to talk a little bit about your new book and what you're dealing with in Speechless. I think I have a pretty good clue of your content's going to be, but I think folks need to know so they can hopefully pre-order it or get it on iBooks or do what they do. But then I want to get into why socialism sucks, and I couldn't think of anybody better to kind of help me kind of clarify this for our audience, because a lot of folks have questions about what they're hearing, the rhetoric. So first, tell everybody about Speechless and what they're gonna find when they open up the first copy.
Well, I guess I should be happy to say this from a marketing standpoint, but I'm unhappy to say this as an American, that the problem that the book deals with is playing out in real time right now. Censorship, cancel culture, wokeism, political correctness, whatever term you want to use, we're talking about the same phenomenon here. Americans, conservatives especially, are being shut up for saying perfectly ordinary and commonplace things. Notably, to say a baby is a human being. A baby is a baby. You're not really permitted to say that anymore in a lot of places. So the question you've got to ask yourself is, we've been aware of this problem of political correctness for a long time, really since the 1980s, kind of exploded in the 1990s. Yeah. We've known it's a big deal. Trump launched his campaign in 2016 on this issue. He said the biggest threat to America right now is political correctness. So we've known it's a problem. We've been trying to fight against it. And yet at every turn we've lost. It seems in some ways the harder we fight back against it, the more ground we seem to lose. We've lost it on marriage. We've lost it on sex itself. We've lost it on life. We've lost it on the American flag, for goodness sakes. You're not even really permitted to respect that anymore. Now it is much more common to see left-wing politicians protesting the American flag or disrespecting it. So how did we get here? I believe the problem is that political correctness creates a trap for conservatives. I think there are basically two ways that conservatives have reacted to it, and either way actually advances political correctness, because the point of PC is purely negative. It is just one thing and one thing only: to destroy traditional standards. And right. the brilliant left-wing theorists who came up with this idea of political correctness, they were explicit about this, and I quote them at length in my book. This is not some kooky theory that I pulled out of thin air. They were quite direct about what they wanted. They were building on Karl Marx's famous dictum that he wanted to engage in the ruthless criticism of all that exists. And this is a very tempting political strategy, because you can criticize anything in this fallen world, right? Everything is imperfect in this world we're living in. So out of this, you get something like critical theory. What's critical theory? Well, once you get past the pretentious jargon, it's to criticize. That's the whole theory. And you see this playing out today. So it's a purely negative campaign to destroy the old standards, and there's two ways we react to it. The first way is the squishy way, where we just go along. You know these types. Yeah. These are the very weak conservatives who, if we're told that we have to call Bruce Jenner a woman, they'll go along with it, and they'll go along with just about anything. Okay, well, that obviously advances the left's agenda because they themselves are advancing it. Okay, but there's another reaction, and you see this from, it seems like the opposite kind of conservative, where they say, I'm not going to go along with political correctness. I'm not going to go along with the new woke orthodoxy. I'm not going to call Bruce Jenner a woman. And you can't make me, because I've got free speech, darn it. I'm a free speech absolutist. I'm a free speech purist. And so what that latter group does is they give up standards entirely. The first group of the squishes, they trade in the old standard for the new woke standard. But the latter group of obstinate, stubborn conservatives, they just give up standards entirely. But you see, the problem here is both of those reactions advance the left's agenda, which is to get rid of the old standards. So what you'll hear now very often from these kind of free speech purist conservatives is, you shouldn't be canceled for anything. You shouldn't be censored for anything. Anything goes in speech and action. This is completely anti-historical, both in the United States and elsewhere in the world. Every society at all times has standards, and you can say some things and you can't say other things. And certain things are going to be taboo, and those taboos might change, but there will always be some things off limits. The way I think about it today is, in the 1950s, conservatives loved cancel culture, a sort of cancel culture, right? In the 1950s, conservatives canceled communists. If you were a communist working in Hollywood, if you were a communist in the federal government, if you were a communist really in any segment of society, you could have your livelihood destroyed. You could face criminal penalties, as many communists did in the 40s and 50s. Today, there is also a cancel culture. You can also risk losing your livelihood if you're not a communist. So, I think of Black Lives Matter. BLM, we now all have to go along with BLM. You have to post the black square on social media. You have to wave the BLM flag. You have to say that you support BLM. BLM is an explicitly Marxist organization. They write about this in their About Us page. They've since taken the page down, but it was up for years. And so I think conservatives are really misguided when they say, well, I'm against censorship of any kind. First of all, that's ridiculous. No conservative has ever believed that. From the beginning of our country, whole swaths of speech have been off limits. Fraud, sedition, threats, obscenity. I mean, we were jailing pornographers at the federal level as recently as 2009. This is not some old-timey thing that was totally gotten rid of. Moreover, conservatives today, I don't think any conservative today would say that if John from accounting shows up to the water cooler and he's got a swastika armband on and he starts yelling Sieg Heil, hail the Fuhrer, I don't think anyone believes that he has a right to keep his job. I don't think anyone thinks it would be cancel culture if an avowed Nazi got booted out of work for quoting Mein Kampf or something. Obviously, we think there are standards and there should be consequences to speech. What this means, though, is political correctness is not this abstract battle between free speech on one side and censorship on the other. Actually, it's a more complicated battle. It's a battle between two sets of standards, the old standards that we want to conserve and the anti-standard of the left that wants to destroy our traditional American way of life. And if we want to fight back against it, we need to be willing to offer a substantive vision of politics. We need to be willing, actually, to say no.
Wow, I just added that to my book list, and I have to read this next week or 2 weeks when it comes out, because that is definitely something that I think a lot of we see the people who just refuse to engage in cancel culture. Then you have the other people who kind of give in, and it's like there's got to be some sort of consensus here of where do we go forward in our country, because obviously none of us are for people just walking into movie theaters and shouting fire and causing chaos and having people being trampled to death. Like, there are consequences to some speech. So that's definitely something we care about. And it's something that we hear a lot on campuses, and more so now with the current woke culture of, I'm here in Colorado this month, and we just had a situation at CSU Fort Collins. It'll be the easiest lawsuit we ever win, but the student body actually voted to dictate what speech the Students for Life group can have. That Students for Life group is no longer allowed to advertise nonviolent pregnancy support resources. They're just not allowed. And the school's going along with it. I mean, like I said, it's going to be the easiest lawsuit ever. But this actually isn't just at one school in Colorado. It's starting to spread. And so this is something I think conservatives and pro-lifers have to be prepared to engage in a smart, tactical manner on. So I'm super excited for that book, and make sure everyone gets Speechless. It comes out June 22nd. All right. So I'm going to ask you hard questions.
All right.
I'm interviewing a series of folks in the next few weeks about socialism. And I'm kind of asking the same questions because I'm getting a little bit of different answers from folks, which I think is really fascinating. But I want to back up the conversation. Can you explain to our listeners, Marxism, communism, and socialism? What do those definitions mean? Just at the very beginning, what does it mean to say I'm a Marxist? Or what does it mean to say I'm a communist or I'm a socialist?
I'll use a phrase that the political writer Paul Kenger used, because it's very different. What is the difference between communism and socialism, for instance?
Mm-hmm.
It's hard sometimes to figure out what the difference is. Paul had a good line. He said that Christians go to heaven and socialists go to communism. That communism is the sort of utopian conclusion of socialism. And socialism, at a very basic level, is ownership by the workers, really by the government, of the means of production. Mm-hmm. So it's a concentration of power in a very small number of hands, and it's led to very disastrous consequences where it's been tried as a system of government. But I don't want to just leave the discussion at that. I think that's kind of a cop-out, because Marxism is a very persuasive ideology. Mm-hmm. And it's persuasive for a reason. It arose in its recent iteration during a time where there were serious industrial questions, where there was obvious exploitation, and where people were hoping for a better future. Mm-hmm. It was always evil, and it remains evil today. But I see why it would be so tempting. And I think it's important to think of socialism, Marxism, not as some new ideology necessarily, but as, in the words of Whittaker Chambers, who was an ex-communist, the second oldest faith of mankind. He said that communism began in the Garden of Eden when the serpent told Eve, "Ye shall be as gods." It is this essentially prideful idea that we can totally reconstruct the world. We can reconstruct reality. We need to engage in, as we discussed earlier, the ruthless criticism of all that exists. We need to tear down everything that we know and liberate ourselves from reality itself. And in so doing, we will then create this utopia on Earth. Now, the problem with utopia, the word utopia, people think it means the best place, but it doesn't actually. It means no place, because it doesn't exist. There's a related word, which actually sounds the same, utopia with an EU, which means a really good place, but we know that this sort of society does not exist because we cannot liberate and emancipate ourselves from reality, nor would we want to, I think, really, even if we could.
We try on campuses all the time, but it doesn't really work. You eventually come back to reality when the pills or the marijuana wears off, I guess. And
then you get the hangover.
Yeah, exactly.
And so there were experiments with socialism and communism in the 20th century, and they ultimately failed. I'm not even saying that they failed on a moral front. They certainly did. But also just as a sustainable political experiment, they failed as well. But they did arise and gained a lot of steam in reaction to sort of industrial capitalism. By the way, when we even use this phrase capitalism, let's not forget this is a term that was itself popularized by Karl Marx. So we are kind of viewing the world in many ways as Marx viewed it. And this also ties in with what you'd call neo-Marxism or cultural Marxism, which is the Marxism we're sort of familiar with today. And if you Google that term cultural Marxism, you'll now be told it's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, which is very silly because a lot of people, this is a well-recognized intellectual movement, and the founder of it was Italian. He wasn't a Jew, so I don't know where they get this from, but they try to distract you from it nevertheless. And what the neo-Marxists realized, and this is sort of the theme of my book, Speechless, actually, because this was the beginning of what you'd call wokeism or political correctness. The neo-Marxists realized that the Marxian revolution had failed because the workers of the world did not view themselves primarily as workers. They did not view themselves primarily as economic beings. They did not adopt the radical theories of these Marxists, of these leftists. So it turned out they preferred their traditions and their way of life and their community much more than they liked the radicals' theories. And so what people like Antonio Gramsci, this Marxist theorist and communist politician, or the Frankfurt School, guys like Horkheimer, Fromm, and Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse later reemerges in the 60s as the father of the New Left. They realized that they needed to take hold of the common sense. They needed to wage a war of position whereby they attained positions of influence and then could wield political power. They had to transform, in a word, the culture. And that's why you're seeing a lot of this radical activism now is not focused on economics. It's, Bernie Sanders, I think, is the last old school Marxist who still talks about the workers and the millionaires, and most other people now who advance these ideologies are talking about race. They're talking about religion to a lesser degree. They're talking about the things that actually matter much more to us than our economic circumstances. Yeah, the family, obviously, the family is the bedrock political institution. So they're always going after the family, because that, once you tear down the local community and the churches and the civic associations, the family is that last obstinate political organization before they can rip us all up into atomized individuals and then bundle us up again into a collective. So that's a brief history of 150 years. I guess actually more the entire history of communism going back to the Garden of Eden. But I think it does clarify. I
got in 4 years of my political science classes in college, so that was great.
I'm pleased to hear that, because everyone focuses on the economic component of it, but the Soviet Union was an evil empire, not only because it took away people's private property. It was an evil empire because it was ruthlessly atheistic. It was, it's a spiritual issue as well. And actually, going back to Paul Kenger, is an excellent book called The Devil and Karl Marx.
That's next. Once I finish the current book, that's the next one.
Oh, it's a great one, because Marx had this really wicked sort of spiritual life. He wrote about selling his soul to the devil. He wrote about demons. People described him as a bit of a demon. And the ideology that he espoused and that has become so popular is ultimately not just about, saving a couple bucks or losing a couple bucks. Ultimately, it does seem to partake of the demonic.
You think about China and their system of government today, the CCP, and the evil that they propagate and wage throughout the world and amongst their own people. And it's not just their economic policies that are wrong. There's so much. I remember I was sitting next to some Chinese students that were touring America, and I got this overwhelming sadness, because I thought, they have no idea what this rosary I was holding in my hand meant. They have no, I never really had thought about it until I was sitting next to this person who had no idea who Jesus Christ was and that he was their savior. I don't know, it is evil. So I wanted to kind of start with giving some definitions about what socialism, what Marxism is. I guess you're a Catholic, and I wanted to get some feedback, because I hear often from a lot of Catholic young people almost like this temptation of, social justice, and we need to seek justice with the poor and the underserved. And it's always like, when you hear the word social justice, it always usually means for these folks socialism, some sort of, we need more government intervention, more, higher taxes. How did this kind of seep into the Catholic Church, this socialism, or this feeling that in order to seek social justice, we have to advocate for really bad policies that actually never work?
Well, social justice, properly understood, is a very good thing. The problem is that the left, as it always does, has redefined the terms. So they've taken the words, and they think that by redefining the words, they can redefine reality. But the idea of social justice in Catholic social teaching really comes from a wonderful encyclical by Pope Leo XIII called Rerum Novarum. And if anybody is confused about the difference between social justice and socialism, I would encourage them to read Rerum Novarum and read the other writings of Pope Leo XIII. I'm thinking of Quod Apostolici Muneris is another very important papal writing on this point from Pope Leo, in which, in all of these writings, he refers to socialists as a wicked confederacy, as a pest, as a plague that seeks to steal the very gospel itself. And you don't just hear it from Pope Leo the 13th. You hear it from Blessed Pius IX. You hear it from certainly Pius X, Pius XI, Pius XII. You hear it from Pope John the 23rd even, all of whom say a Catholic cannot be a socialist. Pope John the 23rd, who was reiterating what his predecessors had said on this. I mean, Pope John the 23rd was not the most conservative pope we've ever had, not by a long shot. But John the 23rd, I guess Pope St. John the 23rd, said that no Catholic can subscribe even to a moderate form of socialism. It is not permissible to do that. And you've seen this reiterated again and again, and you see it in the writings of Pope St. John Paul II, who in Centesimus Annus, which is in many ways a, bringing Rerum Novarum and those associated teachings into the New World and into the new century. In Centesimus Annus, Pope John Paul II affirms the goodness and utility of free markets. Not to say that we need to make an ideology or an idol out of markets, but to say that
Absolutely.
these freer markets are more conducive to human flourishing and to justice. So I recognize that there is a lot of confusion in the vague sounding language about Catholic social justice and criticisms, many of which are legitimate, of markets and industrialization. But you've got to get to the details here. We've got to be very specific. And when you read the encyclicals and you read the Catholic teaching on these issues, you find out that not a lick of it is on the side of the socialists. Actually, the popes are in broad agreement. The church is quite clear in its utter condemnation of socialism.
That's absolutely correct. Can you, for our non-Catholic listeners, I'm a convert, so I had to learn the terminology. Can you describe just quickly what an encyclical is for everyone?
Yeah, it's a very important papal writing. I mean, basically, the popes write, they write lots of different things and they give lots of different prayers. And the encyclicals are very important because they tell you something about the pontificate. They tell you something about the times that we're living in and how the church is responding to the times that we're living in. And so I'm not just talking about one or two encyclicals here. I'm not just talking about one or two tweets, from pontifex or something. I'm talking about teaching that's really gone back to the first moments that these specific questions were being addressed, and that the church has been quite consistent on the topic.
Do you think the current Pope Francis, is changing that church teaching on socialism? I know I'm going to lead you on hot water, so if you don't want to answer something because you don't want to be on the record.
Far be it from me to criticize the Holy Father. I mean, Dante did, so I suppose, but I'm no Dante. However, the hallmark, it seems to me, of Pope Francis's pontificate is confusion. It's a very, very confusing pontificate, where Francis has come out and said he knows good Marxists. Some of my best friends are Marxists, that sort of thing. But then he's also said, I am not a Marxist. So I take the Holy Father at his word. That the Pope has issued very confusing statements about homosexuality and marriage, and yet he's also come out and affirmed that the church cannot have such a thing as gay marriage. It's an impossibility, and that the church cannot bless the so-called gay marriages because the church cannot bless sin. I mean, this was a pretty intense and clear statement. So in these competing clear statements, you get a lot of confusion from the Francis pontificate, but I think it's important to note that Francis has not embraced socialism openly. He has not embraced Marxism openly. And I'm not even saying it's because he doesn't want to. I have no idea what the Holy Father wants or doesn't want. I have no idea what his motives are. I'd like to be charitable and just describe the best motives, but we can be, at a very basic level, say that Pope Francis hasn't done these things because he can't. The Pope simply cannot do this. The Pope cannot contradict the church's very clear teaching on these matters.
Yeah. He doesn't have the Daily Wire communications team. He really should. It would help out so many things.
That'd be wonderful too, but at least he's got the magisterium. That's pretty good. Magisterium's pretty good.
I'm like, who's doing communications here? We need to send some people to Rome now. Okay, so I think this is a great kind of basis of understanding of socialism. I often hear from young people on campuses when I'm going to give my speeches and I'm having conversations, tabling out on campuses, those arguments of, well, I don't see how you can be advocating against abortion, how you can say we should abolish abortion, say these extreme statements like this, but yet you pro-lifers are against, and then you just insert any Democrat, liberal economic policy, paid family leave for the first year of every child's life. Why don't you support taxpayer-funded paid leave? Or why aren't you supporting better schools? Let's throw some more money at failing inner city schools. And, against those evil charter schools. You want to fund those evil charter schools. How can you be pro-life? And I think a lot of young pro-lifers, they hear these arguments and they think, wow, they want to help and they want to serve. And so I feel like in their hearts, they truly want to help women. They want to make sure women can, have their child and that have a career, and that their child grows up in a safe environment, an environment that hopefully is prosperous. And so then they feel like they get tempted into kind of buying this rhetoric from the left, these terrible socialist policies, and they kind of fall for them and think, I have to support these things.
To show you how silly their argument is, let's say that they're right about all of it, and really we should have socialist healthcare and this, that, and the other. Okay. None of that is an excuse or a justification for killing babies. The absence of your preferred socialist healthcare plan is not an excuse for killing babies. The failure of certain schools or the direction of funding to this school that you don't like or that school that you do like is not an excuse for killing a baby. The rights aren't even commensurate here. When we're talking about the right to life and the right to park in a certain parking space on, the street down the mile away, I guess those are both political rights, but they're not on the same level. The right to life and the right to go to this school instead of that school, we're discussing political rights, but they're not on the same level. From a very secular perspective, I guess. It's hard to give a secular perspective because at bottom all human conflict is theological. But let's say we're arguing from the Declaration of Independence, which is obviously not even secular itself. But we know that our Creator endows us with certain unalienable rights, according to this document: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are not on the same level because without the right to life, you don't have liberty. Without liberty, you can't pursue your happiness. So these are derivative rights. And to use more explicitly religious language, which Pope St. John Paul II did, the right to life is not one right among many. It is the primary right. It is the right without which you cannot have any other rights, all of which depend upon your life. So no matter what silly political arguments one wants to engage in on schools and welfare programs and whatever, I'm more than happy to discuss all those issues. They are obviously a separate issue. And I suspect the reason that the left always tries to muddy the argument with these irrelevant issues is because they don't have an answer to the question at hand, which is, should a mother have the right to kill her child? Should a mother have that right in this country? I think no. It's pretty clear that a mother should not do that. I think, as St. Teresa of Calcutta pointed out, this is in many ways the cause of evil in the world. There are ultimate metaphysical causes of evil, but as a political issue, if a mother can kill her child, then what can someone not do? That is about as wicked and disordered an act as one could possibly imagine. So they'll try to distract you with welfare or something for a little bit, and then when you point out that's totally irrelevant to the question, then they'll start to deny that the baby is a baby, and they'll say, well, as a matter of science, actually an unborn baby is not a baby. It's a platypus or something. I don't know, a giraffe. I don't know what else the baby would be, but they'll do anything they can to deny that the baby's a baby. And I think that complete shift in the argument shows you how vacuous the first part, which you brought up, really is.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and it's something as a pro-life advocate, when you're getting asked those questions, that's a very easy way to start the discussion of, even if all of these policies that you're suggesting or advocating for, or saying we have to vote for, even if they're 100% correct, would you join me then in advocating against the violence of abortion? Because the person who's arguing with you, they're never going to do that. They're using this as a distraction technique. What do you make of when you hear pro-lifers, make that argument, more liberal, I guess, liberal-leaning pro-lifers make that argument of, well, if we're so pro-life, we need to support universal health care, for example. What's your kind of reaction when you hear that? Because I've heard it, increasingly over the past couple of years. There's groups like Democrats for Life who, at Students for Life, we are honored to work with them on a couple of projects here and there. But I have a real disagreements, because universal health care is not a pro-life policy, and it actually will harm more. And we've seen with Obamacare, that was the largest expansion of abortion ever in our nation's history, beyond Roe versus Wade. And now vulnerable people like my children who have cystic fibrosis are now put at risk, because you're telling government officials that they can decide what drugs my children have access to that can, sustain their lives for years.
We don't even need to wonder about this. It's no longer hypothetical. Joe Biden, who has supported the Hyde Amendment that at least theoretically prevents taxpayer funding from going to abortion. It doesn't really do that, because if any taxpayer money is going to Planned Parenthood, it doesn't matter if they're pretending that they're spending it on staplers and office paper. That money is going to abortion. Money is fungible, and if you're propping up abortion mills, then you are paying for abortion. But hypocrisy is a tribute, vice pays to virtue. So for decades, Joe Biden said, I firmly oppose taxpayer funding going to abortion. People have the right not to fund this stuff. And then he just changed his mind. And the argument he gave for why he changed his mind is actually a pretty good one. It's ghastly, it's evil, but it's a pretty good one. He said, look, I had that opinion back when healthcare was private, basically, but now we're talking about federal programs. And as such, if people are not going to have many options for their healthcare, if they're basically just coming to us, then they need to have the access to abortion that I support. And if it's being paid for by the taxpayer, so be it, because that's the only game in town. So, just as a practical matter, when you have socialist healthcare, that will lead to very bad consequences. It also will lead to the rationing of care in a way that's quite wicked. I mean, I suppose markets ration care too, but not quite in the same way. Nobody in the United States dies on the street because he was turned away at a hospital. Hospitals will take anybody in. This was one of these stupid arguments during Obamacare, the debates in 2008, 2009. There were many of these, but one of them was that people are dying in the streets because the hospitals won't take them in. That's just not true. It's not even legal to do that in America. So the hospitals take people in, and then actually you and I pay. People who have health insurance will just pay for that, and it's a little bit of a premium. But people do die on the streets. People are turned away in countries with socialist healthcare. I've driven past the Havana hospital, and I was there with someone who was Cuban, and I said, oh, there's the Havana hospital. And he said, yes, that's right. I said, anybody can go in, right? He said, yeah, anybody can go in. They can't get medical care, but they can go in. You got to bring your own drugs. You've got to bring your own
toilet paper.
Yeah, you have to bring your own toilet paper and your own pillows, but you can go in. You just won't get it. And obviously it just operates on a black market. So again, this is a sort of practical argument against it. But in practice, it just leads to pretty ghastly things. And then there is a philosophical opposition to it, which is that it's anti-human. And when the government is providing everything for you, then you're ceding much of your control, and you're ceding a lot of your will. You're ceding a lot of your dignity. I think about this with the universal basic income, which is just, we're talking about one specific entitlement program. The universal basic income is just that.
I've heard this from pro-lifers too, right? Yeah, I've actually heard this from pro-lifers that if we had this, women wouldn't choose abortions.
Yeah, which is very silly, because you're first of all, it's undignified to not work whatsoever, to just take something for nothing and not. And I'm not saying that we all need to go work in the widget factory, but you need to do something with the life that the good Lord has given you, and you shouldn't just loaf around. Sloth is a sin. But the suggestion that the reason that people get abortions is primarily economic is not borne out by facts. If you just look at the sort of people who are getting abortions, there are many cultural factors here that are not economic. But it also buys the kind of Marxist premise that man is fundamentally an economic being. And conservatives buy into these arguments way too often. I mean, the libertarians buy into this argument in many ways. They pretend that all man cares about is money. And money's, a nice thing to have, but we are moved by other things as well. There is more between heaven and earth than just dollars and cents. This is why the neoliberals, on the left, and the libertarians on the right have sometimes, and the neoconservatives on the right, have sometimes been sort of confused as to what's going on in the Middle East. Why are these tribes of people warring in the Middle East? Well, Barack Obama has an answer. He says it's because they don't have jobs and they don't have iPhones. But if we just give them iPhones and jobs, then they'll stop fighting. And I think, Barack Obama, just because you don't believe in anything, just because in the decadent West, but certainly the left and even the right to a large degree, doesn't really believe in any transcendent truth and moral order and reality, doesn't mean that that's true of the rest of the world. Actually, the rest of the world has other motivations beyond the almighty dollar. So I would just caution people who, maybe for good intentions, adopt this idea of the Homo economicus, that basically economic man. Just recognize you're buying into the same wicked ideology that out of the other side of the mouth you're condemning.
That's exactly right. Especially when you think about, we as pro-life advocates, we're the ones saying that every human person has dignity and value that was created by the God of the universe for a purpose, with a purpose. And you don't see that in a communist economic system. You are simply just a widget maker. And that is all you are. And that we all know we are fundamentally all more than just widget makers. So thank you, Michael, for coming on today. I really appreciate you kind of kicking off this special mini season and kind of defining these terms for us as we have these ongoing conversations with, we're going to be interviewing some professors, Trent Horns, a Catholic apologist who wrote the book, Why Catholics Can't Be Socialists. I'm interviewing a evangelical pastor to get the evangelical approach to why socialism is problematic and not good and evil. So there's a lot of different folks I'm interviewing, but thank you for kicking us off in the right foot for this mini season and giving us your time. And make sure everyone go and get Speechless. It comes out June 22nd. I know I'm adding it to my book. After I read Paul's book on the devil and Karl Marx, I'll read Speechless. So that's next. So thanks so much.
The list is getting longer, but I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me on. It's really great to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you all for tuning in to Explicitly Pro-Life. Make sure you subscribe and tell your friends, your pro-life Democrat friends. Make sure they listen to this season for sure. Bye, guys.